Good morning. It's September 12th, and this is Janet McElligott in Los Angeles, California. What Sudan did 24 years ago today saved civilization, and that's not an exaggeration. The day before, one of the most horrific things the world has witnessed, and surprising things, was 9/11 and the destruction of lives, property, and honestly, just faith in humanity, when terrorists took a hold of 4 airplanes and used them as weapons. I was on the phone that whole day with people in the Middle East, and the next day when the world was in shock and silent, one of my friends, whose name was Prescott Bush, he was George W. Bush's uncle and George H.W. Bush's eldest brother. He was a friend of mine. He was the chairman of the U.S.-China Chamber of Commerce, and I sat on his board. Prescott called his nephew, who was the president of the United States, and he said, "I told you to work with this woman. She could help you with the Arabs." And then Prescott called Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell and said the same thing. So on the 12th of September, I got a call from Jendai Fraser, who was calling at the direction of the president, Colin Powell, and Condoleezza Rice. And she said, "I understand you can help us with the Arabs." So I said to her, "Do you want the bin Laden files?" Many of you know that Osama bin Laden lived in the Sudan from 1990 to 96. And he was there as the head of the bin Laden group. And his job was to build a road from Khartoum to Shendi, where the pyramids are in the Sudan. And Osama, by all means, was an excellent engineer. And he was someone who knew what he was doing when it came to building. But if you listen to Hassan al-Tarabi, Tarabi would say, jihad, jihad, jihad. Even he got tired of the constant yabbering, is what he called it. And when bin Laden started to meet with Ayman al-Zawahiri from Egypt, it wasn't that the Sudanese intelligence services were really looking at bin Laden, but they were concerned because the Egyptians were coming down, and they didn't like the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood coming in. Now, Sudan had what we'd call a political Islam government, and they didn't want it radicalized any more than it was, because it wasn't about war on everybody, but there will be plenty of people who disagree with that statement. So there was a man named Hasibella who worked for Yahya Hussein and Gudbi al-Mahdi. Gudbi and Yahya ran the intelligence services in the Sudan. They tasked Hasibella with following everyone who came to see Osama bin Laden. And they didn't do it in the way that American intelligence does, which is, let's just watch them for a minute, let's report on it. No, Hasibella had human intelligence. And every time someone came to see bin Laden for almost 5 years, 6 years, they followed that guest. They followed them to bin Laden's house. They followed him to bin Laden's farm, which was on the Nile. They followed them to bin Laden's mosque, to his house in Riyadh. Wherever they went, they followed them. And then when that person who had come to visit got on a plane and left, so did an intelligence officer from the Sudan. And when that intelligence officer got to Egypt or Afghanistan or wherever it was he was going, the intelligence officer followed that man, and he went and found out who the family members were. Was this guy married? Where was his mosque? Where did he go to school? And so the Sudanese had accumulated file after file after file on all of the founding members of Al-Qaeda. And they tried to sound the horn. They tried to get the United States to listen, and they tried without success. In fact, instead of being successful, the American government put Sudan on the terrorist list because they just didn't get it. And it was during this time period that I came to Sudan for the first time. And one day I'll tell you the story of bin Laden as I knew him, if you want to hear it. But I was tasked with going back and forth between the intelligence services and the FBI. I was a citizen, not an intelligence officer, and I wasn't the CIA. So I tried to get the U.S. to take these files. And on that morning when Jendai Fraser called me and I told her what these bin Laden files were, she was shocked. And she said, "Oh my God, how come nobody knows about these?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what the Clinton people were doing, but they gave me an official cease and desist letter from the Office of Foreign Asset Control in the U.S. Treasury, and they threatened me with arrest. In fact, in 1998, I fled to Kazakhstan to get away because I had death threats." And she was shocked when I told her this story. So she asked me if I would consider becoming the head of counterterrorism at the White House. But nobody knew what they were going to do in the wake of 9/11. And I did know one thing, having worked at the White House in a very unimportant position for W's father, that there were rules and regulations that governed what any employee could do at the White House. And I said to her, "You realize I've worked for the Kazakhs, for the Chinese, for the Sudanese, and I listed all these people. And I said, I've worked with everyone that we don't like." And she said, "Well, maybe that's what we need right now." And I said, "Until the laws change, I'll be more valuable on the outside." And she goes, "Would you talk to Ambassador Bob Oakley?" And I asked who that was. She said, "He's the head of counterterrorism at the State Department." And I said, "Of course I'll talk to him." So not long after she and I hung up, Ambassador Bob Oakley, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Counterterrorism, called me. And he said, "Can you help us? I understand you can help us." He didn't know why he was calling me, only that the president told him to call me. And in between the time that Jendai called me and Oakley called me, I called Yahya Hussein. And I said, "Yahya, the Americans are finally listening." And he was upset. And he said, "You know, they should have listened long ago. Why should we help them now?" And I had a fight with Yahya. And I said to him, "Fine, then don't help the Americans, but you help me. I can stand on my back porch and I can smell the burning of the Pentagon." I said, "I've helped you. Who helped you when your wife was sick? Who brought vitamins for your son? Who helped your mother? Who gets you your headache medicine?" I said, "It's me." And he said, "Fine, but they have to ask." So when Oakley called me and I explained to him what this was, he said, "Great, have them call me." And I said to him, "No, you have to call them." And he said, "I can't call them." And I lost my temper. And I said, "What the hell is wrong with you?" I said, "How can you sit on your ass at the State Department and stand on fucking protocol?" And he goes, "Listen to me. I cannot call him." And so I asked him, "Are you saying that if I can get him to call you, you'll take the call?" And he said, "Yes." So I told Ambassador Oakley, "Give me a phone number that Yahya can call and no one else will answer, that it goes to you and goes only to you. And if you're on the phone with the president, you get off, because this is how we save the United States." And he said, "Yes." So then I called Yahya and I said to him, "You have to call him." And I had told Oakley what to say. I said, "You have to ask for these files because he's not going to offer them to you. You've slammed the door in the face of the Sudanese too many times. You've slammed the door in the face of people who tried to help us in '98 when they had captured bin Laden's bankers. You must ask Yahya to please help." And I said to Yahya Hussein, "If Oakley doesn't politely ask you, then you have fulfilled your wish to me and your promise to me." He said, fine. About an hour later, Ambassador Oakley called me, and he said, Janet, I've worked in the government for 40 years. He said, I've never met anyone as efficient as you. What is it that you want for doing this? How much do you want? I said, there's one thing I want. I want the United States to get involved in ending the civil war in the Sudan. I want it done in a productive way. And he said, you could ask me for any kind of money that you want. And I said, they're helping us end this war. I want us to help end their war. And he said, well, I'll do what I can. And I said, no. You are the government. You will make this a priority. And at that moment, my cell phone rang, and it was Yahya Hussein. And I said to Oakley, I said, can you hold on just for a minute? Yahya's calling me on the other line. And Yahya called to tell me that they would help. And I said, I'm on the phone with Ambassador Oakley. I'll talk to you later, okay? Get some sleep, and I'll talk to you tomorrow. He said, all right. And so I got back on the phone with Oakley, and he said to me, was that the head of Sudanese intelligence checking in to tell you that he had done what you asked? And I said, yes. And he goes, I don't understand that. And I said, that's the problem. These are my friends. We haven't treated them as friends. And Oakley did what he promised. It wasn't long after that that Senator Jack Danforth came to the Sudan to talk to Ghazi Saladin Atabani and decide if he wanted to be an envoy for peace. One day I'll tell you that story if you want to hear it. But people ask me why I do these. And it's because I cannot forget what you have done for us. I can never forget that the Sudan saved my country. In the 6 months following 9/11, you captured 583 Al-Qaeda members. You stopped a second wave of bombings. Most people don't know that. I know that. The world will know that. And as the army marches on to El Fasher and to Niala, the army will save Darfur. And I will cheer the loudest. Thanks.